Thank you for that, Rhonda. Would you take your Bibles with me this morning and turn in them to Genesis chapter 50? Want to tell you this morning, we just got back from probably our hardest, most difficult wilderness trip that we've done so far, and the particular terrain out east, we were in New Hampshire. When we were in the trails in the forest, the terrain was so difficult that we had to keep our heads down for lots of the time, and it's fall there, and the leaves were on the ground at the end of our trip, at least a portion of them, and that looking down so we didn't trip over the rocks afforded us opportunity to look at the beauty of the fall leaves. And as I've shared with you before, you get to see the true color of a leaf in the fall versus the summer. And in doing that, we got to see the brilliance of these New Hampshire fallen leaves. And I want to tell you this morning that that is the essence of each person in Jesus Christ. That Jesus wants you to look your true, meant, designed brilliance in Him. You and I are reflections of Jesus Christ. And His objective is to shape us and form us so that when you look in the mirror and when people look at you, you are getting to see the truest reflection of Jesus through your personality and your gifts and your skills and the like. That's what's happening in your life right now. In the joys, in the sorrows, in every portion of your life, God is at work through Jesus Christ to bring about His image in you so that as people walk by you, they see the beauty of Jesus in you. And the passage such as this morning is meant toward that end. We're essentially seeing a burial of Jacob. And I want to give you another image from our trip. It was a difficult trip. One of the slight things that made it difficult was that as we went to New Hampshire, we thought that we would be able to have fires at the end of the day, which is a really encouraging thing. It's chilly, it's a great time to fellowship around the warmth of a fire. And while you could have fires in the White Mountains, there are, in our particular loop that we did, there were really only 3 campsites that had regular water. And so these are the only places people could really stop and have a water source on what was called the Pemi Loop. And so because of that, and because of the volume of the hikers that hike through this particular loop, they had to preserve those tenting areas, and you couldn't have fire. And so I wanted, to get to the bottom of it, and I asked one of the caretakers, the significance, or one of the guys that I can't remember who asked, but he began talking, and, I don't think he knew Christ, but he just began talking about those particular areas, and he said, the thing is with as many people walk through this area and camp here, if we allowed people to have fires, there'd be no food for Mama. And he's talking about Mama Earth, likely. But his point is that if we allowed all however million people hike through this a year, 1,000 people hike through this a year, and they were to strip the forest essentially of all the firewood to burn it, it would take all of the resources away, and that firewood, instead of decomposing and nourishing the ground to help those areas of the forest, those areas of the forest would die out, and those areas of the forest are the areas where we have firewood, and so that would, water, and so that wouldn't be good. And so I began thinking about that as I walked through these trails through New Hampshire, and I began looking at the fallen trees with a new appreciation. That as these trees have fallen and as they decompose, they're nourishing the ground so that the forest can continue in a healthy way. And what we're looking at this morning is we're looking at essentially a massive tree in the book of Genesis that has fallen. It's dead. Jacob is now dead. We've been tracing and tracking his life from Genesis 27. Catch that. Nearly half of the book of Genesis traces Jacob and his kids. So this is a big tree in the forest that is carrying a lot of nutrients that God wants to get into the ground in order to nourish our faith. In all of his ugliness and in all of his moments of faith, God wants us to grab hold of whatever nutrients are in Jacob so that we can grow to be trees that reflect the God of Jacob. And so I want you to essentially picture this morning a dead tree up here on the stage. And we're going to be looking at different portions of this fallen tree. We're going to be talking about the positive. We're going to be talking about the providence, God's providence in this fallen tree, in the burial of Jacob. And we're going to be looking at the positive portions of Jacob's life, in brief, of course. So we're going to be considering the negative, the providential, and the positive. These are sort of our three headings as we consider the fallen tree of Jacob before us this morning. But I want you to keep in mind that as we consider it, the point of us looking at the nutrients in Jacob's life and death, its end result is so that you look the way God meant you to look. That's the point. That's the prime objective of these few verses in the book of Genesis. So I want to start with the negative. Jacob's death is unique in Genesis. How is it unique? Well, Abraham, when he died at age 175, the narrator records, Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man full of years, and was gathered to his people. Does that sound good to you? That sounds pretty good to me. If you got to die, which we all have to die, that sounds like a good way to die. He was ripe for death. Good old age, full of years. Consider Isaac's death. He died at 180. Narrator records, and Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. Does that sound good? That sounds good. That sounds good to me. And it was. We get to Jacob, however. Jacob, instead of dying in the realm of 175, 180, Jacob dies at 147. The narrator records, when Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. There is no reference to old and full of years, full of days. There's none of that. The narrator, albeit subtly, wants you to know that Jacob died early. That's the point. And if that weren't enough, Jacob himself tells Pharaoh that his years have been few and evil and have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers. So there's a difference. There's a recognizable, notable difference in the way Jacob died as opposed to Abraham and Isaac. He is in his own category. And that's important for us to understand. But there's more. When we look at Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we find in each one that they all faced a famine. Every one of them faced a famine. Abraham faced a famine, and as a result of him facing that famine and being threatened by starvation, he ventured to Egypt. Did that turn out good or bad? Bad. He shouldn't have went to Egypt. That's the narrator's subtle hint in the way it turned out with Abraham in Egypt. But if that weren't enough, Isaac also experiences a famine, and God explicitly tells Isaac, don't go to Egypt. So now we know Abraham shouldn't have went to Egypt because he explicitly tells Isaac, don't go there. I'll take care of you in the land. Don't leave the land of promise in search of food. I will take care of you. And then Jacob comes, and guess what? Jacob experiences a famine. But you know what's different about Jacob? God actually tells Jacob to go to Egypt. And you got to ask the question, why? Abraham clearly shouldn't have went to Egypt. Isaac is actually told not to go to Egypt. Do not leave the promised land. And Jacob is explicitly told. So is God's arm too short to save Jacob in the promised land during a famine? We know it's not too short because it wasn't too short for Isaac. He took care of Isaac in the promised land throughout the famine, and he would have taken care of Abraham. Abraham realizes that after God saves him from his situation. So why did Jacob leave? Why did God actually tell him to leave? Well, here's where it's very important that we understand that the book of Genesis is not a book. It's a chapter. Genesis is not a book. It's a chapter. It's a chapter of a 5-chapter book, which is known as the Pentateuch or the Torah. So Genesis fits with Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. It's a chapter within that greater whole. And if that's the case, which it is, and we'll get into that in weeks to come, but if that's the case, then we should expect Genesis to jibe with these other 4 books. We'll get the law in the other 4 books, but we should expect that the intent of the law is present in Genesis, and we find that it is. In the book of Exodus, we'll hear Moses tell Israel from the Lord that a child should honor their father and mother. And as the child does that, he or she will live a long life, but not just live a long life, they will live a long life in the land. So we look at Jacob's life under that scrutiny. And we say, did Jacob honor his father? And the answer that we've been reading from Genesis 27 on is the answer is no. Because God has disciplined him for what he did to Isaac for several years. And retraced that lie over and over and over in Jacob's life. And so, if we read Exodus and look back at Genesis, we find that Jacob lived a short life and he died outside of the land, very likely as a direct result of not honoring his father. So God could have preserved Jacob in the promised land, even through the devastating famine that took place. But as a direct result of Jacob's sin, Jacob had to die a premature death outside of the land. But as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't even stop there. You see, we find in Genesis 15, when God cuts covenant with Abraham and he has him divide these beasts, and God himself will walk through the middle while Abraham is fast asleep. Before Abraham is cast into a deep sleep, there are some birds of prey that come and begin eating the food of the beast that Abraham had cut according to the word of the Lord. And it says that Abraham had to drive them away. And as you cross-reference that Hebrew word for these birds of prey with other passages in the Old Testament, commentators deduce that it was a particular type of hawk that was likely the bird of prey in Genesis 15. And it's significant because that particular hawk was the bird by which the Pharaoh in these first centuries, that was the bird by which he himself was depicted. And so a foreshadowing of sorts is taking place in Genesis 15 in saying that there's going to come a time when the birds of prey, namely this particular hawk, which is typified by the Pharaoh of Egypt, will come and mess with God's covenant of God's covenant with his people. And Abraham has to drive them away. Abraham gets cast into a deep sleep. In that deep sleep, as God himself passes through the split carcasses, he tells Abraham in his dream that there will be a period of 400 years where their people will live in a land that is not their own. I'm going to tell you at this point that this is getting into Ben Lovelady's conjecture, so you can go with me there or you cannot. That's your choice. But I wonder about the year 400. Is there any significance to that? And where I would take this is I would say, okay, if we're right about Jacob dying outside of the land because he didn't honor his father, and if we're right about saying that Jacob didn't live long because he didn't honor his father, and that's why he died outside of the land, we'll see Moses die outside of the land as well. In the Old Testament law, we find that those who turn their hearts away from the Lord, their sins will have an effect on even to the third and fourth generation beyond them. And me personally, I believe that Jacob's descendants will live in the land of Egypt that is not their own for 400 years because Jacob spent the majority of his life running from God. On the run from grace, like a fugitive, figuring out things for himself. And as a result of that, his family will stay in Egypt for 4 generations. It's my personal belief. You can go with me there or not. But the question we have to ask is, what does this negative portion of Jacob's life teach us? And if it teaches me one thing, it is this. Do not run from the Lord. Don't do it. Don't do it. Stop in your tracks wherever you're at and turn around. And start doing what God's telling you to do. Don't play around with him. God is a God that is slow to anger, but he will not be fooled around with. And he will, in his love, discipline us. And it is serious business. And if we're not careful, it will even go beyond us onto our kids. So stop. Stop right now. Whatever is in your life that is not supposed to be there, whatever promises you've made with God that you're renegotiating right now, I'm telling you to stop. God is telling you to stop. He will not be renegotiated with. The terms that he has laid down for you, whether explicitly in his word or privately in your personal walk with him, he will not mess around with. So I want you to stop. And I want you to do what's right. I've shared with you the story about John Piper and his boys when they went to visit a friend's house who had a big German shepherd. And as the boys got out of the car, the German shepherd was around them. He loved on them. He licked them. He was all for them. And John said he forgot something in the car, so he said to one of his boys, "Hey, would you go back to the car and grab this?" And the boy instinctively began to run back to the car. At which point, the German shepherd followed with his nose to the ground behind the boy with a low growl, and the boy was petrified. And the owner of the dog said, "Stop, son. He loves you, but he doesn't like it when you run away from him. So walk." And Piper used that as a fitting illustration for God. That God loves us. But when we run from him, we see the sternness of his love. I may have shared with you before my friend Tony Laidlaw. As his kids, Caden and Gabe, were entering high school, it was a new realm, it was a new school. There's going to be a greater testing of their diligence and intelligence and academic career. And up until freshman year, he and Jill escorted them along in their academics. But at this point, Tony recognized that they couldn't do that through high school, and that there was going to be a greater degree of personal responsibility as they got into high school. And so Tony sat them down. And he said, "Caden, Gabe, Mom and I have walked with you all the way up to high school. We've helped you remember your assignments. We've helped you with these things. But we're telling you right now that these next 4 years are on you. And we are going to be there to help wherever we can. But there needs to be a greater degree of responsibility that now falls upon your shoulders and your brains." And he said, "We will help you at every step of the way. But I'm telling you right now that I'm going to periodically check your grades. And if it is not in this particular realm with which Mom and me know that you're capable, we will make you think that video games never existed. And that friends never were. And that weekends were not fun. And we will make your life absolutely miserable if you turn away from this responsibility. But if we check your grades and they're where they should be and we know they can be, then we are everything good in your life, and you will have an awesome high school career." This is essentially a fitting picture of God. And Jacob went into high school, and he did it his way. And now he's living in his 20s, and he's living through his 30s, and he's dealing with the vast repercussions of a fugitive from grace life. And friend, young and old, I don't want you to experience that. As young as I am, I've seen these repercussions of sin in my own life, and I've seen it in others as they've jumped off cliffs. And the devastation it has had upon their children, to the point where it just makes me want to put on sackcloth and ashes with them as we see the destruction that their sin has brought. Don't be among that tribe. And they would tell you the very same thing. So this is Jacob in this point saying, "Look, I've died young. I'm dying outside the land, and it's affecting my kids. And I'm telling you, don't waste your life on something lesser." So that's one portion of the nutrients that's going into the ground, a nutrients of warning, caution. There's a second portion of nutrients from this fallen tree that's also simultaneously going in the ground. And that is the nutrients of providence. There are so many nuggets of truth in this cluster of verses that is meant to bolster the faith of the Israelites and of us. First of all, when God is telling Jacob to go to the land of Egypt, he says, Jacob, when you get there, Joseph himself will close your eyes at death. And it's here fulfilled. We find in this passage that upon Jacob breathing his last, Joseph is the one who falls upon his face and bathes his face with Joseph's tears. It's very likely at that point, as he's weeping and kissing Jacob, that he himself closes Jacob's eyes. It's not hard to take that step from the way the narrator describes it. He's the one that handles his burial. But far beyond this fulfillment of God's promise, we see in this passage a foreshadowing of the future exodus of Israel out of Egypt after the 400 years. We see it all over the place in this text. What do I mean by that? What I mean is when you see Jacob leave Egypt, his body leave Egypt and go to be buried in the promised land, there are so many literary hints that are foreshadowing when Israel will leave Egypt during the time of the Exodus in the book of Exodus. Where do we see that? Phrases involving going up to the land are used 6 times in the remaining verses of Genesis. That's a lot. And it will be a popular way to describe what happens in the book of Exodus when Moses is saying to Pharaoh, let our people go up to the land. Go up, up, up. It's mentioned over and over here, and it will be mentioned and be a theme in Exodus. And so the narrator is saying, look at, just like God will take Israel up from Egypt to the land of Israel out of slavery, so he's doing the very same thing with Jacob's body right now. But it's greater than this. The narrator takes great pains to stress that all the servants of Pharaoh accompanied the entourage. All the elders of the land of Egypt went with the entourage. All the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. And what this is demonstrating is a unanimity of action, both on the Egyptians' part and the Israelites' part. They were all together in this exodus from Egypt. And God's saying the exact same thing will happen after the 400 years when my people leave the land of Egypt. Egypt will be locking arms with them, sending them out. Not just that, but some of the Egyptians will actually go with them and lock arms with Israel in faith when that time comes. Beyond that, we find mention here of Egypt's chariots and horsemen that went with Jacob's body as a form of security, likely. But we'll find this same phrase of chariots and horsemen mentioned over and over and over again in the Exodus as Pharaoh changes his mind, chases Israel down, and those chariots and horsemen are buried in the sea as it closes on top of them. Beyond this, we find that the Canaanites in this passage are affected by the Egyptians' response to Israel. Do you notice later in the passage it says when they mourned for Jacob, the Egyptians, it says the Canaanites noticed it and they said, wow, the Egyptians are like majorly mourning this guy. And that also is a foreshadowing of what's to come. Because Canaanites like Rahab will see how the Egyptians, or how God treated the Egyptians and God's effect on the Egyptians, it will actually affect the Canaanites like Rahab, and they'll say, wow, we see what God did to the Egyptians, and so now we know that your God is the real God. So what's happening here in microcosm, setting it up for what's to come, and not just that, but finally, the actual route, which is a bit of an unusual route to leave Egypt and go to Canaan, is the exact same route that we'll find God sends Moses on as he takes the Israelites out of Egypt. So what you're seeing here, what the narrator wants you to see, as you see that Genesis is chapter 1 of the Pentateuch, of which Exodus is chapter 2, he's giving you a foreshadowing, a microcosm of, look, Israel, the way God saved you out of Egypt, he also saved your father Jacob and his body. In other words, it's been God's intention all along to bring you out of Egypt and back into the promised land, even amidst Jacob's sin. And so what is the message to the reader? It's simply this: allow your roots to grow into the steadfast love of God. It will never fail you. The steadfast love of God, which are expressed in his promises, will never fail you. As counterintuitive as God's will is, and God's ways are, and God's commandments are, as counterintuitive as they are, as much as they may not make sense to us, as much as our emotions and our will wants to do the wrong thing, God's way will never, mark it, never let you down. So whatever you're wiggling on, whatever temptations you're succumbing to, know that God's promises are better. They'll never fail you. They will never fail you. You will never, ever regret following God into the hard places. He will be faithful to save you. And every decision you make on his terms, he'll be faithful. So never negotiate it. However weak it might seem to do God's will, however unjoyous it seems to do God's will, however difficult it looks, never back off. Never. You'll never regret that. God is faithful to do what he's promised. Listen, if he can take a lowly shepherd like Jacob and get him into Pharaoh's land and then have everybody but Pharaoh himself actually go. They took 70 days to mourn and inter Jacob. Do you know that that's just too shy than they would have treated Pharaoh himself? It would have taken 72 days for Pharaoh, but they gave 70 days to Jacob's body. If God can do that with some shepherd that has no home, he's a Bedouin shepherd living in a tent. If God can take this massive world empire of Egypt and have him treat this guy this way, can't he do anything? His answer is yes. So trust him with everything. If he can do this with that, he can fix every one of what you think's wrong. So trust him while you're in it. Never renegotiate. Never, ever renegotiate. The other Sunday, a while back, I was here by myself, studying in the afternoon, and a woman approached the door, and I was a bit unnerved as the only one in the church to have her come in the church. And so I'm torn between what to do, and I didn't answer the door. Of course, I was guilt-ridden in my conscience, knowing she probably needed something. And so as she went back to the car, I came outside and talked to her outside. And she was inebriated. And she said, I've screwed up my life, living with a guy I shouldn't live with. Everything's wrong. And I remember growing up in the church, and everything was good and golden and happy, and I want to get back to God. And I said to her, okay, here's the thing. You're drunk right now. And I said, God doesn't allow drunkenness. But there's something that happens when you're drunk that doesn't normally happen, and that is, you tell the truth like you've never told it before. And I said, so you're telling the truth right now about your life. And I said, here's the danger. I'd love to meet with you, but now's not the time. I'd love to meet with you tomorrow morning. I'd love to meet with you Monday morning, right here at the church. I gave her my number. I gave her the church's number. And I said, but here's what I want to warn you about. You're going to wake up tomorrow, and you're going to think you have it together all over again. And she said, no, there's no way I will say I have it together. I need help. I want to get my life right. Everything's going wrong. I am going to call you. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to do it. I said, okay, but make sure you remember that you need to do this because you're going to try to counsel yourself out of it. And I never received the call. She didn't, in all the truth that was spilling out of her heart at that moment, she woke up sober and suppressed every amount of truth that came out of her mouth. And she went back to putting her hope in this guy, in her life, in alcohol's inebriating effect to help her move on from day to day. You pray for her. But God's call here is to put your hope in His steadfast love and absolutely nowhere else, however trustworthy it might appear at the time. So that's the providence in God's life. We see God's providence in Joseph closing his eyes and all these hints at what's to come. But we also see some positive in Jacob's life, continuing off this girl's testimony. And that is, Jacob had his breaking point, like this young girl had her breaking point, but it actually turned out to not be a breaking point. Jacob had one, actually. Jacob was broken. I tend to look at his testimony to Pharaoh as a place of brokenness, acknowledging himself that his years have been few and evil. They've been bad. Pharaoh is tempted to admire him for his many years of life, and he stops him short and he says, no. As many years as I've had, they're actually few, and they're evil, and they have not attained to the stature of my forefathers. Don't marvel at me, mourn me, because I've been a fugitive of grace, Pharaoh. But as Jacob comes and as he sees Joseph and as he experiences that God actually has been with him his whole life, he's hinted at it different moments of his life. He remembers that when he went to Laban, all he had was his staff and the clothing on his back, and that God had made him rich. He saved him from Esau. Seeing Esau, he says, like seeing the face of God. So Jacob had these moments where he said, God, you're real. I sense that your angels did go with me when I left the promised land, and they did bring me back, and they kept me alive through Esau, and now they've even restored to me Jacob when I've been willing to dethrone Jacob off my idol shelf. God, I believe that goodness and mercy has followed me all the days of my life, and that I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So Jacob has this transformative moment as all these moments in his life, few as they are, build up. And he says to Joseph, Joseph, when I die, you take me to the promised land. Set aside Rachel. I want to be buried in the promised land. Dethrone Rachel. Where a person was buried in the ancient Semitic times was essentially a declaration of their faith. It was like a baptism of sorts where they stood in the water and they said, I am Jesus's. As far as any ear can hear, I stand with Christ and I'm glad to be purchased by him and hidden in him. That's what happens in the baptismal waters. And Jacob effectively says that at his death. He says, Joseph, take me home. And home is in God's land, nowhere else. My lot is cast with God. He's been faithful to me. He says, I never thought I'd even see you again, and now I'm seeing I'm seeing my grandkids. I'm seeing my kids. I'm seeing your kids. And it's just glorious, and my lot is cast with the Lord. I'm safe with him, so bury me in the land. Pastor Alex noticed a very profound fact, that this is essentially the first time that Jacob is relying on someone else to secure for him God's blessing. All through Jacob's life, he sought to secure blessing for himself, his way, his know-how. And here, he has to rely on Joseph, and he has to rely on the Lord in a new, profound way. And it seems as though, as much as he stresses it to Joseph, that he's ready to rely on someone else for the first time in his life. He's broken. He's come to the end of himself, and it's a beautiful end. Maybe one of my favorite moments in this last wilderness trip was on the last day. It's a terrifically difficult trip, as I've stressed to you. The eastern hiking developed in a way that's different than the western hiking, and so while the western hiking hurts your lungs, the eastern hiking hurts your lungs and your legs, your knees. And I'm in the back of the pack, and I'm hiking with Greg Griffin, and we're hiking the last day down the mountains, and Greg's in front of me, and Greg had stubbed his toe in a nasty way. His toenail's coming off. He's just in all sorts of pain. And he says to me, he says, you know, he says, if it wasn't for how bad my feet hurt, he said, I'd be hopping down these mountains like a gazelle. And I pause a second, and I say, Greg, I said, let's try to be a little more accurate. I said, you'd be going down these mountains like a wounded cow. And he busts out laughing, and we're both just dying laughing. And he says, man, he says, you could have been a little nicer. He says, you could have at least said a wounded bull. And so we have nicknames. We came up with nicknames for most of the guys on the trip, and Greg's nickname is Wounded Bull. But what I loved about Greg's response is he didn't deny the wounded part. And that, to me, is a typification of not just Greg as a person, but the way every Christian stumbling through this life should live. We are a wounded people by sin, in desperate need of a fixer, in desperate need of a Savior who keeps us together and moves us from point A to point B by His grace, and shows us our sin and shows us our dysfunctionality in all of the ways that we need to see it so that we can move forward following Him and not taking some rogue course. We need to own our brokenness and look to Him as the physician who can move us successfully from point A to point B. And Jacob came to the end of his life, and for the first time, I think, embraced his limp as he drew up his feet onto his bed. As much pain was still in his hip as he did it, it was a beautiful wound that the angel of the Lord gave him, because it was a typification of who he actually was his whole life. And so I think as Jacob died, He was happy to embrace his limp. This is who we are, because as we see our limp, we understand that our weakness is our ticket to get on the Jesus train that brings us safely home. We're working through a catechism with our kids, and some others in the church are doing that as well. I highly recommend it. The City Catechism. The first question of this little booklet asks this: what is our only hope? Only hope in life and death? And the answer is this: that we are not our own, but belong to God. And the greater answer, as it gets filled up more and more, is this: that we are not our own, but belong body and soul, both in life and death, to God and to our Savior, Jesus Christ. That is your and my only hope in this life. Not that you get the job that you want. Not that your marriage ends up exactly the way you want it, or your kids turn out exactly the way you want it, or whatever it is with your health goes away and you're given an additional X amount of years. None of that is your hope, or how lunch minusculely turns out this afternoon, or your evening turns out. It's not about any of that, how your week turns out. It is not about that. Your only hope in life and death is that you are not your own, but belong to Him through His Son, Jesus Christ. That is your only hope. So Jacob approaches his death. And John Bunyan, in his book Pilgrim's Progress, gives a very picturesque view of what it's like for a Christian to enter death. Christian and his friend and compatriot Hopeful have been journeying together to the celestial city. And the final portion that they need to cross is a river. And this river is symbolic of death. And the river looks deep. And the men that they're speaking to, the angels that they're speaking to, say, this river lies between you and the gate to the celestial city. And there's no bridge over this river. And Christian and Hopeful look at the river and it looks deep, and they get nervous, and Christian begins looking this way and that, and he begins wondering, is there any way across this river that doesn't involve going through it? And they say there's only been 2 men that have made it to the celestial city that haven't crossed this river. And that's Enoch and Elijah. But you need to cross the river. Otherwise, you'll never get to the gate of the celestial city. And they're so afraid, especially Christian. And they ask the angels, they say, but how deep is it? And this is the way they answer their question. Essentially say, we can't help you as far as its depth. You shall find it, listen to their words, you shall find it deeper or shallower as you believe in the King of the place. You shall find it deeper or shallower as you believe in the King of the place. And so Christian and Hopeful venture into the waters. And Christian immediately says, the depth, It's gonna go over my head. I can't do it. And as he's doing it, he's thinking of all his sins, and he's thinking of his sins before he came to Jesus and his sins after he came to Jesus. And he says, it's going to overwhelm me. I can't do it. And he's pulling on Hopeful, and he's about to pull Hopeful under the water. And Hopeful saying, Christian, I can touch the river's bottom. I can feel it. It's under your feet. It's there. Stop thinking about these things. And he's counseling him, and he's helping him, and Christian's in this panic-stricken state as he's thinking of all his sins, and he's focusing on all his sins. And finally, Hopeful says to him, Christian, Jesus has made you whole. And Christian's eyes open up, and he understands that it's on Jesus' merits that he's making it to the gate and not his own. And suddenly he can feel the river's bottom, and it's shallow. And he walks out of the river. Jesus has made you whole. That is your hope in the river. Jesus has made you whole. I want to read to you a portion of the book that we read for our wilderness trip, The Life God Blesses by Gordon MacDonald. My neighbor's wife was dying of cancer. I was at the hospital with him as we waited for her life to end. It was a difficult moment because she thrashed about in her bed in semi-consciousness. And no medication or medical treatment seemed to bring her a modicum of rest. It was clear to me that the physicians and the nurses had exhausted every means at their disposal to assist her in this dying hour. And it was a difficult thing for them because during her illness they had all come to love her. So their professional poise was affected by emotional attachment. I'm not given to doing this kind of thing, but I felt impelled to ask permission to step to her bedside. In turn, the medical personnel surrounding the bed stepped back. It was clear that they welcomed anything that anyone, including a pastor, could do. I placed both of my hand on Jay, and he doesn't give her full name, Jay's emaciated shoulders, now thinned by the ravages of this terrible ordeal, and I gently pressed her back into her pillow. Jay, I said, it's Pastor Mac. Listen to me. Are you listening? Do you hear me? She looked at me with eyes that were filled with fear, almost panic. Yes, Pastor Mac, I hear you. Jay, I'm going to say something to you, and I want you to listen as carefully as you can. Don't move. Don't speak. Just listen, okay? Yes, Pastor Mac. She whispered. I'm listening. And then I reached deep into my soul for the simplest, most familiar words of the Bible. And I said, the Lord is my shepherd. I have everything that I need. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me to still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me on paths of righteousness for His name's sake. And even though, and here I paused and repeated myself several times, and even though I walk through the valley of death, I am not afraid. I have nothing to fear. Do you hear that, Jay? Nothing to fear, because you are with me. Jay, we've known each other for a lot of years, and we've talked about this moment when any one of us might go to be with Jesus. You're going first, Jay. He's a wonderful shepherd, and He's ready to take good care of you. Do you hear me, Jay? He's ready to take good care of you. I felt the anxiety, the panicky energy leave her. Her eyes became soft, and she relaxed in her bed. And then I listened, as with a calm voice, she turned to her husband and whispered, calling him by name. Thank you for being so good to me, for loving me. You've been a good husband, and I love you. And then Jay looked to her daughter. Mommy loves you, dearest. Be strong for Daddy. And then to the medical personnel who stood there. Thank you for taking such good care of me. Thank you for all you've done. I love you all. Almost instantly, following those words, Jay closed her eyes and went to sleep. A few minutes later, she met the shepherd face to face, crossed the threshold of death, and understood for the first time the full meaning of everlasting life. This fate is a fate that can only be experienced by one who has cast their lot in with another. And his name is Jesus Christ. Friend, if you have not done that, now is the time. Jacob did that, albeit late in life, and he is walking with Jesus right now and is anxious for the time when this world and heaven are made one and we can enjoy him for eternity in the new heavens and the new earth. And that is your fate. Like the thief on the cross who joined Jesus late in his life, that is his fate, as it will be yours if you put your faith in Jesus Christ. Jacob's only caution would be this: start walking with him now rather than later, and experience the fullness of life that I experienced, albeit way too late in mine, earlier in yours. Amen? I'm going to ask the musicians to come now. I encourage you, if you have not put your faith in Jesus Christ, if you want to talk, please come forward. You can come forward during the song. You can come forward after the service. Walk according to the Spirit. Make an appointment with me this week. Whatever the Spirit puts on your heart, I would love to talk with you.